The letter arrived on a Tuesday, postmarked from Inverness, Scotland, but scrawled in a hand Eleanor Reed hadn't seen since 1937, her brother's. Her fingers trembled as she broke the wax seal. Inside was a single page, yellowed at the edges, bearing only 7 words in faded ink. "Come to Dunbray, the truth awaits." Samuel. Samuel had vanished 4 years earlier without explanation during a summer folklore expedition across the Scottish Highlands. Eleanor, then 23, had written to consulates, filed reports, and traced his last known movements to a village that no one seemed to recall. Dunbray had not appeared on any map or in any local archives. A ghost town in every sense, if it had ever existed at all. Now, with the world trembling on the edge of global war and Boston streets echoing with ration talk and enlistment drums, the past had risen from the ashes. Eleanor stared at the envelope, the ink, the foreign postage. Her world, so carefully rebuilt in the wake of Samuel's absence, wobbled like a teacup on a crooked shelf. If mysterious atmospheric stories like this capture your imagination, don't forget to subscribe. These are the tales that slip through history's cracks, just like the one you're hearing now. That evening she sat by the fireplace in her apartment on Beacon Hill, the city's fog pressing in against the window panes. The letter sat on the table beside her, as though it might vanish if left unattended. She reread it countless times, her thoughts spiraling. Could he still be alive after all this time? The idea was impossible. But then again, so was a letter from a dead man. Eleanor wasn't prone to fantasy. She was an archivist at the Massachusetts Folklore Society, a woman of order and method. Yet even she couldn't explain the cold ripple in her spine as the wind outside howled with something close to a voice. She'd seen him once, in a dream. A mist-shrouded moor, his figure barely visible through the swirling fog. He hadn't spoken, only pointed toward a crooked village church as shadows bent and twisted behind him. That had been 3 years ago. She had dismissed it as grief, as longing. But now? By morning her mind was settled. She booked passage on the SS Cameronia, departing for Glasgow. She told no one. The last time she'd spoken of Dunbray, colleagues had offered tight-lipped smiles and pitiful nods. Poor girl, still chasing ghosts. Perhaps she was, but she needed answers more than closure. And maybe, just maybe, Samuel needed her. On the train north from Glasgow, the landscape grew wilder. The fields stretched empty and golden under the waning light of autumn, framed by hills that felt ancient and knowing. Crows followed the tracks like omens. She clutched her brother's letter in her coat pocket the entire way. At Inverness station, she found a lone man with a cart willing to take her as far as the old stone bridge near Glen Bray. Beyond that, he warned, the roads were unreliable, especially come dusk. When she mentioned Dunbray, he hesitated. "Strange folk live past the bend," he muttered. "Best not go poking about." But Eleanor's resolve didn't waver. She'd come this far, and something, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps instinct, compelled her forward. As the cart rumbled over gravel and moss, the mist began to rise like smoke from the earth. The driver grew quiet. Birds fell silent. Trees leaned inward as though listening. By the time the cart stopped, the light had turned the color of pewter. The driver wouldn't go farther. Eleanor climbed down, adjusted her scarf, and stepped into the growing fog. A narrow footpath wound through the woods ahead. Beyond it, if the letter was true, lay Dunbray. Her shadow stretched behind her on the damp road, long and silent. And for the briefest moment she thought it moved, not with her, but just slightly after. Eleanor Reed had always been drawn to what others called forgotten. While other girls collected perfume bottles and dance cards, she hoarded crumbling newspapers, local myths, and the hushed superstitions passed between grandmothers on dusky porches. She believed every old tale held a grain of truth, buried beneath exaggeration and fear. Born in Providence, raised in Boston, she had been orphaned young and brought up by an aunt who believed emotion was something to be locked away in drawers. Samuel, her older brother by 5 years, had been her only real connection to warmth. He was bold where she was cautious, impulsive where she was meticulous. But most of all, he had believed in folklore, in ghosts, in the invisible threads that tied stories to place. When he vanished in 1937, it fractured something in her. The police had labelled it a disappearance. Some even whispered he'd joined a commune, or worse, the underground war build-up in Europe. But Eleanor knew better. His letters had stopped too suddenly. His notes, always detailed, had ended mid-thought. And there had been that final postcard, never mailed, found tucked inside one of his books back home. It read simply, "They don't want to be remembered, but they need to be." In the 4 years since, Eleanor buried herself in work. She became one of the youngest researchers at the Massachusetts Folklore Society, where she catalogued regional legends and contributed to academic journals. Her colleagues praised her diligence, her silence. No one realized she was sifting through old tales not out of passion, but hunger for anything that might bring her brother back. Now, standing at the edge of a mist-wrapped wood in northern Scotland, the air wet and sweet with peat and pine, she felt Samuel's presence like static under her skin. The footpath was narrow, laced with creeping roots and velvet moss. As she walked, her boots softened the quiet, and the trees, ancient oaks and skeletal birches, closed in above. The path seemed longer than it should have been, or maybe it only felt that way because time had thinned here, stretched between memory and myth. She passed a crumbling milestone etched in runes she didn't recognize. A raven watched her from a low branch, its head cocked. Somewhere far off, a church bell tolled, though no church had been marked on any map she'd studied. Eleanor's breath quickened. She touched the envelope in her coat pocket again, grounding herself. "Dunbray," she whispered aloud like an invocation. Then, quite suddenly, the trees parted. The village appeared not with grandeur, but with quiet insistence. Nestled between hills like a secret, Dunbray looked as though it had been forgotten even by the earth itself. Stone cottages leaned wearily under thatched roofs. Smoke rose in lazy curls from crooked chimneys. Sheep wandered unattended through overgrown gardens, and yet something was off. She stepped onto the main road, little more than packed dirt and stone. Windows stared at her, but no one stood behind them. The air smelled of rosemary and iron. She passed a well, its bucket resting just above the water's surface, as if someone had abandoned it moments before. Then she saw them. A group of children near the square, 5 or 6, all under 10. They played in silence. No laughter, no shouts, just the slap of bare feet on stone. One girl skipped rope while 2 boys pushed a wooden wheel with a stick. When Eleanor approached, they stopped. One boy tilted his head. "Hello," she offered gently. None responded. Instead, the smallest child, a girl with pale hair and hollow cheeks, lifted her hand and pointed toward the far end of the village. Then, just as suddenly, they all turned and scattered, disappearing between houses like smoke. Eleanor followed the direction of the gesture. A church stood in the distance, its spire bent slightly, as if bowing under a great weight. The wind carried a whisper then, just beneath hearing. Not quite words, but a shape, a feeling. She tightened her coat and moved forward. Her shadow followed. But not quite in step. The village of Dunbray breathed like a living secret. It was neither lifeless nor lively, suspended instead in a hush too profound for mere silence. Eleanor stepped slowly down the lane, taking in the moss-covered stone walls and crooked wooden signs swaying faintly in the chill air. Shops stood with their doors ajar, but unmanned. Laundry lines stretched across alleys, yet no hands gathered them. Everything suggested presence. Fresh footprints in the mud, a kettle whistling faintly in the distance, a rocking chair shifting on a porch, yet no one was truly seen. It felt like walking through the memory of a place. Eleanor paused near a low stone wall enclosing what might once have been a garden. She crouched beside a broken sundial, the numbers barely legible under creeping lichen. When she looked up, her breath caught. A woman stood a few paces ahead, watching her. Elderly, wrapped in layers of worn wool and a black shawl embroidered with silver thread. She had eyes as pale as ash and skin like crumpled parchment. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, the knuckles swollen and red. Eleanor straightened. "Good afternoon," she said. The woman didn't speak. She looked at Eleanor's feet. Then, slowly, her gaze shifted to the ground beside her and lingered. Eleanor followed her eyes. Her shadow, cast by the soft grey light, should have stretched behind her. It did, but it bent at an unnatural angle, twisted as though resisting the direction it was meant to take. For a heartbeat, it hovered, then snapped into alignment. The old woman's lips parted. "Yours still walks," she rasped. Then she turned and vanished between two narrow stone houses, leaving the scent of lavender and wet wood behind. Eleanor's pulse thudded in her ears. She stared at the space the woman had occupied, then at her feet again. Her shadow looked normal now, flat and obedient. She told herself it had been a trick of light. The trees, the angle of the clouds. But the seed of doubt had been planted. A narrow side path led toward the church she'd seen earlier. Drawn by something deeper than logic, Eleanor followed it. With each step, her boots crunched on gravel, and the wind picked up, whispering through the hollow windows of empty homes. The church loomed as she approached. Its stone facade was cracked, ivy creeping up its sides like veins. The door hung open just slightly, swaying in rhythm with the wind. A rusted iron bell rested on a wooden frame beside the entrance, its rope frayed and unmoving. Inside, dust motes danced in the pale light pouring through stained glass. The pews were worn, some overturned. A faint smell of wax and old smoke lingered, and above the altar, painted in flaking gold leaf, were the words, "In stillness, truth." She stepped forward, fingers brushing the back of a bench. A sound echoed behind her, light like footsteps on stone. She turned, heart quickening. No one. But a breeze stirred her hair, and with it came the faintest sound like whispering, not in words but in tone, regret, longing, a sorrow that had sunk into the bones of the place. Eleanor sat, suddenly aware of how heavy her limbs felt. She took the letter from her coat and unfolded it once more. 7 words, that was all. But they had brought her to this place, to this silence, to the edge of something vast and waiting. Her eyes lifted to the arch above. Through the stained glass, clouds rolled like smoke. Then she noticed it. The sun outside had shifted, casting long beams through the windows, but none of them produced shadows on the church floor. Eleanor left the church with a tight knot in her stomach. The air outside had grown heavier, as though the mist itself pressed closer now, curious, listening. The path wound back through the heart of Dunbrae, where chimneys exhaled faint trails of smoke, but still no one came into view. She turned a corner and stopped. There, on the steps of a narrow stone cottage with red-painted shutters, sat a cluster of children. The same silent ones from before. They sat close, knees to chins, eyes fixed on her with unsettling stillness. "Do you know Samuel Reed?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft but urgent. None answered. But the youngest, a boy with a sallow face and eyes too old for his body, reached into his pocket and held something out. Eleanor stepped forward. It was a paper doll, crude, folded, with a scribbled face and tiny arms cut at strange angles. One arm was longer than the other. The figure bore a faint mark across its chest, an X. She knelt. "Did someone give you this?" The boy didn't move. Only when she reached to take it did he speak, barely a whisper. "They come at dusk. That's when they forget." Before she could ask more, a door behind the children opened with a creak. An old woman stood there, thin as winter, with a deep scar down her cheek and hair tied back in a severe bun. Her voice cracked like dry leaves. "Get inside, all of you." The children scrambled through the doorway without a word. The woman's eyes met Eleanor's. "You shouldn't be here." "I received a letter," Eleanor replied, "from Samuel. He said the truth was here." The woman's gaze narrowed. "Then he was cruel to call you. I think he was in Dunbrae before he disappeared. I have to know what happened." The woman hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Come in, before the light goes strange." Inside, the cottage smelled of peat smoke and lavender. Dry herbs hung from ceiling beams. A kettle hissed faintly on the stove. The woman moved with slow precision, as if every gesture mattered. "I'm Morna," she said. "No title left. Used to be something once, a midwife, some say, a liar, others say." Eleanor sat on a worn stool near the hearth. "You said the light goes strange?" Morna nodded. Shadows don't behave the way they should. Haven't for years, not since the Hollow opened. The Hollow? A place, a moment. Depends who you ask. Morna poured tea without asking, handing Eleanor a chipped mug. This village thought it could forget, bury what it didn't like. But truth doesn't rot. It waits. Eleanor leaned forward. Did you know Samuel? Morna didn't answer at first. Her eyes drifted to the fire, then to Eleanor's shoulder. I saw one follow him, back then. He was marked. Marked how? Same as you. Eleanor stiffened. What do you mean? Morna stood and took a shard of broken mirror from a shelf. She held it up before Eleanor. Watch. The fire flickered behind them. Eleanor looked at her reflection and saw her shadow on the wall. But it was moving differently. Slight delays in motion. The shape of her hand lagged behind when she lifted her cup. The outline of her head turned too slowly. Eleanor's throat tightened. They're not ours anymore, Morna whispered. They've remembered something we tried to forget. Before Eleanor could speak, a loud clang echoed from outside, the iron bell beside the church. 3 slow tolls. Morna's face paled. They haven't rung it in years. Eleanor stood. What does it mean? It means they know you're here. The window panes darkened as the last light of day faltered. Eleanor stepped toward the door, driven by a need she didn't understand. Behind her, Morna spoke once more. You're part of it now, girl, whether you believe or not. Eleanor opened the door. The village outside had gone unnaturally still. And for the first time the fog began to move against the wind. The bell's echo faded into the hills, but its presence clung to the air like smoke. Eleanor stepped into the dimming light, her breath quickening. She wasn't sure what she expected, an assembly, an explanation, but the village remained quiet, doors shut tight, windows shuttered. The fog shifted again. This time it crept low along the ground, swirling with unnatural purpose. She walked quickly, retracing her steps back toward the square, toward the church. The silence deepened, oppressive now, as if the land itself was holding its breath. At the church doors she paused. They were shut tight now. She pressed a hand against the wood. It opened soundlessly. Inside, nothing had changed. Dust still floated in narrow sunbeams. The altar stood cold and waiting. But now something drew her gaze leftward to a set of narrow stairs behind the pulpit, half concealed by a torn tapestry. She descended carefully. The stairwell opened into a cramped cellar. Candle stubs lined the stone shelves. Old bottles, broken hymnals, and rusted tools filled the corners. And on a table beneath a layer of dust sat a bundle wrapped in wax cloth. Eleanor hesitated, then unwrapped it. A diary, leather-bound, weathered, the cover scorched at one corner. She flipped through it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Samuel's. The entries were dated from late 1937. The ink was hurried, some passages blotted, but the tone was unmistakable, frantic, breathless. They speak in the corners now, just beyond the reach of lamps. I don't know if they're truly separate from us, or if they are what we buried in ourselves. Further down, the widow says the hollow can't be closed unless it's seen, that the land keeps what memory forgets. She flipped again. A sketch of the village map, crude but detailed, marked with a strange symbol just beyond the southern ridge. Beneath it, one line, "The shepherd waits where no sun walks," her blood chilled. The shadow shepherd. The name had been whispered in one of Samuel's earliest letters. At the time, Eleanor thought it poetic metaphor, his usual flair for drama. But now it loomed with weight. She read on. I saw one today. Mine. Not in a mirror, not on the ground, but standing across the lane. It didn't move when I moved, it watched. They told me I'm the first in a long time marked. Not for death, but for memory, that's worse. The pages that followed grew more chaotic, ink smudged, handwriting jagged. The hollow breathes. I heard it last night, like someone crying beneath the soil. Eleanor closed the diary, her hands shaking. She climbed the stairs quickly, emerging once again into the sanctuary. The light had shifted again, duller now, tinged faintly red, as though dusk had arrived prematurely. Outside, the fog thickened. Her feet took her instinctively toward the cottage, to Morna. But the door was shut now, locked from within. No sound came from inside. Eleanor turned back toward the square. Her thoughts raced, every instinct now sharpened by fear and revelation. Samuel hadn't simply disappeared. He had discovered something ancient, buried deep in the soul of Dunbray, a village that tried to forget, a people bound by a silence older than language, and shadows that had ceased to obey. She remembered the children, the doll, the scarred woman's warning. Somewhere in this village was a place called the Waking Hollow. Somewhere Samuel had walked into its heart, and something had watched him go. The fog pressed tighter now, curling around her ankles like fingers. She pulled the diary close and began walking again, unsure of her destination. But the feeling in her chest had changed, no longer just fear, now a certainty. The truth hadn't waited passively, it had been calling, and she had answered. Night fell abruptly in Dunbray. There was no gentle fade of color, no stars appearing one by one, only a swift dimming, like someone had closed the sky behind a door. Eleanor sat alone in the corner of the abandoned schoolhouse she'd taken refuge in. The church had grown too cold, and Morna's cottage remained sealed. She had found a cot covered with an old tartan blanket and tried to rest, but her body refused stillness. Each creak of wood, each gust of wind, sounded deliberate. She opened Samuel's diary again. Most of the final pages were smudged, words trailing off mid-sentence. One entry stood alone, dated November 13th, 1937. They don't fear the dark. They fear forgetting. Every lie this village told gave them strength. A crash startled her, not from outside, but within the room. A chalkboard eraser had fallen somehow from a ledge where it had rested untouched for decades. Eleanor stood, heart pounding. Her eyes scanned the walls, the floor, the windows, then froze. There, beside the old teacher's desk, her shadow stretched across the floor. But it was wrong. It was standing. She blinked. No. It only looked like it had lifted itself from the floor, the distortion too pronounced to be chance. The shape of her legs warped, the angle of her arm curling backward unnaturally. She stepped back. It delayed, then caught up. She ran. Outside, the fog swallowed her whole. Her breath hit the cold air like steam. The village was quieter than ever, the only sound her own footsteps on damp cobblestone. Lamps, though unlit, flared briefly as she passed, flickering with an eerie blue flame before dying again. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to move. The silence felt alive now, observing. She turned a corner and stopped short. A figure stood at the far end of the lane. It didn't move. No lantern, no sound, no greeting, only presence. She squinted. The outline was human, but too thin, elongated, like something stretched beyond its original shape, as if it had once been a shadow and forgotten how to be flesh. Eleanor backed away, but her legs didn't obey at first. The air thickened, clinging to her limbs. Then she turned and fled toward the forest's edge, the way she'd come days earlier. The trees might offer concealment, cover, something. Branches clawed at her coat, snagged her sleeves. Behind her, footsteps emerged. Not from the figure, from behind her, from with her. She turned. Her shadow. It flickered beside her, cast somehow by moonlight that didn't exist. It moved fast, too fast. Always one step behind, or ahead. She stumbled, collapsed to her knees. The ground was cold, slick with dew and rot. She pressed her palms into the earth, whispering to herself, trying to remember something solid, her name, Samuel's voice, the shape of her mother's hands. Then, a whisper right in her ear. "You forgot me!" She screamed and flung herself backward. No one was there. But the air had changed. Softer now, charged. She rose, trembling, and looked down. Her shadow was still, perfectly aligned, but she knew it wouldn't last. Back in the village, windows glowed faintly again. Doors creaked open, not in welcome, but like sighs released after holding too long. She returned to the square. The children stood there again. This time they weren't silent. They hummed. A low, tuneless sound, eyes wide and vacant, swaying slightly. One girl reached out and took Eleanor's hand. Her palm was cold. "They'll come for you soon," she said. "Who?" Eleanor whispered. The girl didn't answer, only tilted her head toward the forest. "Because now you see. And seeing makes you part of the remembering." The humming grew louder. And Eleanor realized what terrified her most wasn't the silence. It was the sound of voices beginning to return. The forest felt older by morning. Eleanor walked with care, the fog receding slightly with the first pale light, revealing twisted trunks and wet moss that shimmered like cold skin. Her clothes clung damp against her frame, the night's fear still clutched in her bones. The village behind her had not stirred. No more humming, no more children. But the girl's words haunted her. "Now you see." She followed a trail marked only by instinct. The diary had hinted at a man, an exile, who once kept records of the old rituals. Samuel had written only one name beside a crude sketch of a cabin, Magnus Cairn. She walked until the light shifted again, breaking weakly through the canopy. Then, in a hollow shaded by yew trees, she saw it. A cottage, if one could still call it that. Stones patched with wood, moss for roof, smoke curling from a crooked pipe. A wind chime made of bones hung from the eave. Eleanor approached and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again. A voice growled from within. "If you're shadowless, step back." "I'm not," she said, unsure if it was true. Silence, then slow movement. The door creaked open to reveal a man tall and wiry, beard like coarse rope, eyes the color of burned sky. He looked at her with suspicion, sharpened by solitude. "You're not from here." "No," she said. "I'm looking for Magnus Cairn. You found him." "I'm Eleanor Reed." "My brother came here years ago. His name was—" "Samuel," Magnus interrupted. "Yes, I remember." He turned, leaving the door open. Inside, the space was tight, but not disordered. Dried herbs hung above a small stove. Books lay open on a table, covered in notations. The air smelled of pine and iron. "I read his journal," she said, stepping inside. "He mentioned you. Said you knew what Dunbray tried to bury." Magnus grunted. "I know what they still bury." He poured tea without asking, then sat on a stool worn smooth by time. Eleanor remained standing. "Why did he come here?" she asked. "To see if the stories were true," Magnus said. "To prove that memory and shadow were once the same." Eleanor furrowed her brow. "What does that mean?" "The body forgets. So does the mind. But the shadow, it remembers. Every lie, every omission. Long ago this land had a pact. People lived with their shadows, not beneath them. They listened. To shadows? To what they carried. Regret. Guilt. Truth. Then one day the village decided to silence them. A ritual. Old blood. Something was severed. Eleanor felt a chill rise in her spine. "And Samuel?" "He listened too closely. He entered the hollow against my warning. He saw what had been made there." She stepped closer. "He's alive." Magnus didn't answer immediately. He stared at the fire. He became part of it, of the remembering. He gave his voice to it. Willingly or not, I can't say. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Can I reach him?" Magnus looked at her finally. "If you go there, you don't come back unchanged. That place feeds on stories we refuse to tell. I have to know." Magnus stood, walked to a shelf, pulled down a roll of faded parchment. He unrolled it. A hand-drawn map, forest paths, stone markers, and a black X. "That's the Waking Hollow. You'll know it when you're near." The light bends. The wind hums. "But before you go," he handed her a small pouch of dark salt. "Circle yourself before stepping in. Shadows don't cross salt freely. It's not a shield, but it's something." Eleanor took it with a trembling hand. "Why are you helping me?" Magnus's eyes softened just slightly. "Because I listened once and I didn't act. Your brother did. Maybe it's time someone else did too." She nodded. Outside, the wind rose. The trees seemed to lean inward. The path ahead had opened, but so had something far older, something that had waited far too long to be heard. Eleanor returned to the village with the map clutched tight, Magnus's words repeating in her mind like the toll of that iron bell. The path to the hollow was marked, yes, but it was not merely a location. It was history given shape, memory given voice. As she walked, the villagers emerged at last, quiet, watching. Not one of them spoke. She passed the baker's shop, where a man stood in the doorway holding a tray of unbaked loaves. His eyes were hollow, lips unmoving. A child stared at her from a window, her hand pressed flat against the glass. No one cast shadows. They walked, they moved, but the ground beneath them remained untouched by form. Only Eleanor's shadow stretched behind her, and it shifted again, pulling slightly to the left as if impatient. At Morna's cottage, the door was finally open. The old woman sat in a chair by the hearth, hands folded over her lap, eyes rheumy but sharp. "You found him," she said. "I found Magnus," Eleanor replied. "And the map." Morna nodded slowly. "Then it's time." "Time for what?" Eleanor asked. Morna's voice lowered. "To remember what we buried, what we sacrificed." Eleanor stepped inside. "What did this village do?" Morna didn't flinch. In 1839, the harvest failed. Children died, cattle collapsed. The river turned sour. The elders said it was because the hollow had grown restless. So they went to the forest, took a child, an orphan, no name, no kin, and left him there at the edge. Eleanor stared. They sacrificed a child. A shadow is born of presence. That boy had no one to remember him, no name to anchor him. His shadow turned wild. The hollow fed on it, and in return the village prospered. Eleanor felt her breath catch. That's monstrous. Morna's gaze hardened. It worked. For how long? Until 1937, the seal weakened because someone remembered. Samuel. Morna nodded. He asked too many questions, walked the wrong paths, and the hollow saw him. Eleanor's voice trembled. And now it sees me. You carry his blood, Morna said, but more than that, you seek what should be left buried. I seek truth, Eleanor snapped. That isn't a sin. Morna's mouth curled into something bitter. In Dunbury it is. Eleanor reached into her coat and pulled out the diary. Samuel wanted people to know. That means there's a way to end this. Morna stood with difficulty and shuffled to a cabinet. From it she pulled an old iron lantern. Inside, the flame burned blue. This was carried during the ritual. When the sacrifice was made, the lantern stayed lit. Blue fire binds shadow from breaking free. She handed it to Eleanor. You'll need it when you reach the hollow. It remembers you now. But it also fears you, because you still carry your shadow. Eleanor took the lantern. What happens if I don't go? She asked. Then the forgetting continues. But slowly, the balance crumbles. And one day, shadows won't just walk, they'll take. Morna sank back into her chair, breath labored. Go now, while your name still means something. Eleanor turned to leave, then paused. Why did you help me? Morna didn't look at her. Because once, I watched them take the boy. Outside, the village had changed. People lined the streets again, but their faces were blurred by the mist, indistinct. Some held candles. Others simply stood, hands at their sides. None spoke. None moved. The road toward the southern ridge beckoned. She tightened her grip on the lantern and stepped forward. The village did not try to stop her. But the fog thickened, and the wind began to hum. The forest greeted her not with birdsong, but with silence so thick it pressed against her skin. Eleanor moved with slow determination, the lantern's blue flame casting a narrow, flickering path before her. The trail was barely visible now, moss-covered stones and warped tree roots curling like veins through the earth. She reached the first marker from Magnus's map, a crooked U, its trunk split down the center as if struck by lightning long ago. A small charm of twine and bone dangled from a branch. Eleanor circled herself with the salt he'd given her. A trembling line poured around her boots before she stepped forward. The fog pulsed. As she passed deeper into the woods, the wind changed. It didn't blow. It circled. It carried whispers that felt familiar but twisted, as though her own voice were being spoken back to her through cracked glass. Then came the first vision. A figure stepped from behind a tree ahead. Samuel. Her breath caught. His coat was the same one he wore the last time she saw him in Boston, but he looked thinner. His face was paler, hollow-eyed, yet unmistakably alive. "Samuel!" she called out. He didn't speak, only raised his hand, beckoning. She took a step toward him, and her foot struck something hard beneath the leaves. She looked down. A child's toy carved from wood, a spinning top. It was cracked, half buried in soil, too fresh. When she looked up again, Samuel was gone. The fog grew heavier. Shapes emerged at the edge of her vision, tall, human-like, but rippling, as though made of shadow and memory. None came close, but all faced her, heads tilted. She walked faster. The trees thinned, revealing a clearing where the earth sloped downward into a wide, bowl-like depression. At the center stood a stone circle, weathered and cracked, the hollow. The light here had no source. It hovered, cold and bluish, like a perpetual twilight. The lantern in her hand flared once, then steadied. She stepped inside the ring. The wind stopped entirely. No sound, no breath, only her. And then the shadows arrived. They crawled out from the edges of the stones, not like creatures, but like spilled ink reversing its course. They shaped themselves into forms, some tall, some bent, some crawling. Eleanor's skin prickled as they circled her, whispering in languages she couldn't understand but somehow felt. One shadow stepped closer. It mirrored her exactly. It moved when she didn't. She realized with horror it wasn't a reflection, it was her, separated, left behind. It raised its hand, then pointed downward. Eleanor looked. A circle had appeared at her feet, etched with symbols that shifted like live flame. The air vibrated. She clutched the lantern. A voice spoke, not from any mouth, but from within her own memory. "You came to remember. Now you must choose." She turned. Samuel stood at the far edge of the hollow. His voice was his. "Eleanor, don't let them take it. Your shadow is still yours." "That means they haven't claimed you yet." She stepped toward him, but the ground cracked beneath her. The shadows howled, not with sound, but with presence, pressing against her skin like guilt. "You must see it," Samuel cried. Eleanor's knees buckled. She fell to the ground, her hand grazing a stone. It was warm. Images flooded her mind, flashes of the boy from 1839, weeping in the woods. The villagers' faces turned away, the moment the ritual severed his shadow. The pain, the fury, the birth of the hollow. Her tears fell freely. She whispered, "I see you." The shadows stilled. Samuel knelt beside her, reaching out, not touching, only close. "You remembered." And in that moment, the lantern flared bright blue, and everything went white. The light faded. Not back into darkness, but into something else. A space where time didn't move in straight lines, where sound didn't echo but hovered. Eleanor blinked and found herself standing not in the hollow, but beyond it, somewhere beneath or within. The ground was glass-like, reflecting a sky that didn't exist. There were no trees, no fog, no air even that she could feel, only presence. Then he emerged. The figure that stepped forward was clothed in threads of shadow and memory, not a man, not any more, if he had ever been. His form shifted with each breath, now tall, now bent, now childlike. His face was a blur of familiarity and forgetting. Where eyes should be, there were only hollows filled with flickering scenes, a village sacrifice, a boy's scream, a brother calling out into night. Eleanor didn't move. She knew what this was, the Shadow Shepherd. He spoke not with words, but through the marrow of her bones. "You carry memory." She felt her knees tremble. "I came for Samuel." The shepherd tilted his head, as though puzzled by her smallness. "He gave himself to remembering. You came to take." "I came to understand," she said, "to see what was lost." What was silenced? A ripple passed through the being. They forgot us, buried us beneath silence, names turned to dust, shadows torn away like sin. His voice was not anger, it was grief, endless, echoing grief. He stepped closer. Will you give it freely? She knew what he meant. Her shadow. To sever it was to let it walk without her, to abandon memory's burden. To join the hollow, not in body but in story. In silence, her heartbeat surged. I'm not here to forget, she said. The shepherd raised his hand. Then you must see fully. No comfort, no veils. In an instant the world shifted. She stood again in Dunbray, but not the one she knew. The village was whole, bustling, bright under the sun of a late summer day. Laughter echoed in the air. The people were smiling, speaking. Children played. Then she saw the boy, dirty, barefoot, hair falling over his eyes. He watched the others from behind a cart, clutching a doll of twine and bone. No one spoke to him. No one saw him. Then he was taken, dragged by rough hands into the woods. No protest, no farewell, just indifference. Eleanor cried out, but the vision did not hear. She was pulled through again, shown Samuel, wandering the forest, calling names, studying stones, sketching in his journal. Then shown him screaming as the hollow opened around him. Finally she saw herself, standing in the square, watching, not acting. The shepherd spoke once more. You came to know, but knowledge costs. The symbols flared beneath her feet again. Her shadow rose behind her, now unbound, upright, watching. It stepped in front of her, reflected her. Then spoke. You forgot me once. Will you do it again? Eleanor reached out. No. She turned to the shepherd. I won't give it freely, but I won't deny it either. She placed her hand on her shadow's chest where her own heartbeat echoed faintly. I remember now. The shepherd's form flickered, the scenes in his eyes dimming. Then you return bearing the burden. Let it be told. The vision broke. Eleanor collapsed to her knees in the hollow once more. The lantern at her side still burned, but her shadow had changed. It moved now, not just with her, but in anticipation, as though guiding, and the forest around her exhaled, slowly, softly. As if something had finally been heard, Eleanor stood slowly, every bone aching as though she had aged years inside the hollow. The blue glow of the lantern had dimmed, but it still pulsed faintly, enough to guide her back through the stone circle and into the edge of the trees. She no longer walked alone. Her shadow moved beside her now, not just as a shape, but with intent. It shifted slightly when she paused, stretched when she turned, as though it had grown used to being unbound and now chose to stay. The forest no longer whispered. The silence that once felt suffocating now throbbed with something else. Anticipation. She passed the old markers. The charm on the yew tree had vanished. The moss under her boots gave way more easily, as if the forest recognized her passage. When she reached the edge of Dunbray, she found the villagers waiting. Dozens of them, men, women, children, standing in silence, their faces turned toward her, eyes blank. Behind each of them no shadows fell. The fog still hung in patches, but it no longer hid them. It was a hush before storm. Eleanor stepped into the square, her heart racing. I've seen what you buried, she said, her voice trembling. I saw the boy. I saw what you did. No one answered. I saw Samuel. Still silence. Then the church bell tolled once, slow and mournful, and something shifted in the air. One by one the villagers stepped back, parting to reveal the children at the center of the square. Their eyes were wide, but their mouths no longer closed. One girl stepped forward. You saw us, she said. Eleanor nodded. The girl reached into her pocket and drew out a small doll, bone and string, just like the one Eleanor had seen in the woods. It's yours now. Eleanor took it gently. What happens now? She asked. The child tilted her head. You speak. Morna stepped out from a doorway nearby, her breath shallow, her face pale. You still think this ends by silence? She rasped. Eleanor turned to her. No, it ends by truth. She stepped onto the stone platform in the center of the square. And she began to speak. She told them of the boy left in the woods, of the deal made in desperation, of the village's centuries of silence and the price of forgetting. She spoke of Samuel, of his journey, of his sacrifice. She spoke of the hollow, how it grew not from malice, but from memory denied. With every word the air grew warmer. The fog thinned. The villagers blinked. Some fell to their knees. The shadows began to return, not rushed, not violent, but slowly, like children finding their way home. One by one they crept back to their owners, reattaching, reshaping. When Eleanor finished, the square was quiet again, but it was a different silence, a peaceful one. Morna stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "We were cowards." Eleanor shook her head. "You were scared, but now you're remembered. That's what matters." A breeze passed through the square. Light, true light, broke through the clouds overhead for the first time. It cast shadows, real ones, all around her. Even the church bell seemed to gleam. Eleanor turned toward the woods one final time, and for a moment she saw him. Samuel. He stood at the edge, smiling, not with sorrow but with peace. He nodded once, and vanished. Her shadow remained at her side. It moved only when she moved, but now it felt like walking with a friend. The following morning broke with a clarity the village hadn't known in years. The fog had lifted entirely, revealing rooftops in full light, fields rolling out into the hills, and trees that no longer leaned inward as if to listen. But Dunbrae was changing. It started with the stone path leading to the square, cracking softly under Eleanor's boots as she walked. The moss that once clung to the walls peeled back like skin shedding, revealing stones older than the village itself. The air buzzed, not with malice, but with transformation. She watched as the villagers emerged from their homes slowly, cautiously. Their faces had shifted, no longer blank, no longer guarded. They looked at one another with questions in their eyes, and when they spoke, it was in whispers, uncertain, as if relearning sound. The children spoke first. "I dreamed of him," said one boy, "the one they left behind." "He wasn't angry," said a girl. "He was just lonely." Others began to speak, stories tumbling out, fragments of memory, names they hadn't spoken in decades, moments long buried, now unearthed. Each word seemed to loosen the village's foundation. Buildings creaked as if sighing in release. A fence collapsed, untouched. And then, as the bell tolled noon, a low rumble echoed beneath their feet. The earth shifted. Not violently, no eruption, no terror, but like a breath being exhaled. Cracks widened in the road. A portion of the old bakery roof slid free and shattered in the street. Ivy curled back from the church walls. The village was not being destroyed, it was being undone. Eleanor stood in the center of it all, the doll still clutched in her hand. She looked down and saw the shadows, now true, now faithful, returning fully to those who had long lived without them. They bent and flickered, then settled, as if content. The silent children laughed. Voices rang out again, not in fear, but in awe. Morna emerged from her cottage one last time. She leaned heavily on the doorframe, her shawl wrapped tight, face pale but resolved. "You brought the light," she said. Eleanor shook her head. "I only reminded you of it." Morna's lips curled faintly. "That's more than most do in a lifetime." She stepped forward slowly, her shadow stretching behind her for the first time in years. "It's time," Morna whispered. Eleanor moved toward her, but Morna held up a hand. "No. My time." And then gently, as the sun reached its peak, Morna exhaled. Her eyes closed. She slumped to her knees and did not rise again. The villagers bowed their heads. Her shadow remained at her side, kneeling with her. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The village did. The wind passed through Dunbrae, light and new. Grass rose where stone had split. The trees at the edge of the woods straightened, no longer bearing the weight of silence. And above the clouds broke entirely, sky turning a blue not seen since before memory darkened. Eleanor walked slowly through it all, witnessing the unraveling, not of ruin but of release. She passed the places where Samuel had walked, where the boy had once been led into the woods. Where voices had been stolen, and now were found. At the well, a young girl reached into the bucket and pulled up water clear as glass. She laughed, and the others joined her. Dunbrae was no longer haunted. It was remembered. As she neared the forest again, Eleanor looked back. The square shimmered in the sunlight. The village was smaller now, quieter, but alive. She knew she couldn't stay. What had been broken was not hers to own. She had carried the memory. Now it would carry itself. The train from Inverness pulled away slowly, its wheels echoing across the empty countryside. Eleanor sat by the window, her fingers resting lightly on the worn leather cover of Samuel's diary. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, subtle lines of fatigue etched into her face, but her eyes clear, present, changed. She had left Dunbrae before sunrise. No one stopped her. No one needed to. Magnus had met her briefly at the forest edge. He'd said nothing, only nodded once as she passed. In his eyes was something close to pride, or perhaps relief. Then he disappeared into the trees, back to his solitude. Eleanor had walked alone for hours until she reached the nearest road. She hadn't looked back. Now the train rocked gently as Scotland blurred into motion again. Towns that hadn't forgotten themselves, people casting casual shadows without a thought. The quiet hummed around her differently here. Not thick with memory, but light, almost hollow. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Her hand paused as she stared at the letterhead, the Massachusetts Folklore Society. The letter she was drafting had only one sentence written so far. There is a place where forgetting became a weapon. She didn't know what else to say. Back in Boston, weeks later, she stood once again on the steps of the university. The November air was sharp, the streets loud, the world already turning its gaze toward war and headlines. People moved quickly. No one looked up. She entered the lecture hall slowly, carrying her bag against her chest. The room filled with students murmuring, rustling pages, sipping coffee. She reached the podium, removed her coat, and opened the diary on the lectern. "I want to tell you a story," she began. The students fell silent. She told them about Dunbrae, not directly, not in detail, just enough to plant something in the mind. She spoke of silence, of the weight of forgetting, of how places sometimes hold truths too terrible for language. She spoke of shadows, of memory, of her brother, and of how we are all haunted in ways we often choose not to name. When it ended, the students clapped, soft, respectful. One lingered after class, a boy of perhaps 20 with sharp eyes and quiet hands. He approached slowly, gripping a notebook. "Your story," he said, "it reminded me of something." She smiled. "Good. That's what stories are for." He hesitated, then added, "Some places don't want to be found." She tilted her head. "And yet, we find them anyway." He gave a faint smile, then turned to leave. As he walked away, Eleanor noticed something that made her breath catch. The floor beneath him. He cast no shadow. She rose from her seat, heart suddenly pounding. But when she stepped into the hallway, he was gone. Only the faint echo of his footsteps remained. That night she returned to her apartment and opened the trunk at the foot of her bed. Inside were clippings, letters, field notes, fragments of memory. She took out Samuel's diary and placed it carefully beside a blank leather-bound volume. She dipped her pen and began to write. "They told me shadows could lie, but I've learned the truth. They remember what we choose to forget. And when they return, it's never to harm. It's to remind." Outside her window, the wind shifted, and the city lights flickered briefly, as though something unseen had passed through. New York, 1956. The lecture hall smelled of chalk, old wood, and the faintest trace of ink. The room was larger than any Eleanor had ever taught in, its domed ceiling painted with constellations, the past arcing above her in quiet permanence. She adjusted the microphone and waited for the crowd to settle. The audience tonight wasn't just students or folklorists. There were historians, journalists, publishers. Her book, Where Shadows Once Walked, had stirred curiosity across more than just academic circles. Some called it fiction, others speculative memoir. A few believed every word. Eleanor never clarified. She began, as always, not with explanation, but with a question. "What does your shadow know that you've forgotten?" Silence followed. Then, the rustling of notebooks. She spoke of landscapes older than memory, of rituals that shaped villages, of the difference between silence and forgetting. She never named Dunbray directly, but its presence lived in every phrase. When she finished, the applause was long and lingering. Some stood. Afterward, a small line formed by the stage. She signed books with a practiced hand, nodding to familiar questions. Did you really live through it? Was Samuel real? Do shadows truly change? Eleanor smiled politely, answering only what needed answering. Then, near the end of the line, he appeared. A young man, tall with dark eyes that did not blink enough. He wore a grey coat with old buttons and carried no book. "I've read it twice," he said softly. "It's not a story, is it?" Eleanor's smile faded. She studied him. "You tell me." He stepped closer, voice low. "They still walk. Not all of them, but some." Her breath caught. "Where?" He tilted his head. "Everywhere people pretend not to remember." Then he turned and walked away, vanishing into the milling crowd like mist dissolving into air. She sat alone in the hall long after the lights dimmed. Later that night in her hotel room, she stared out at the city skyline. Cars moved far below like currents of light. The moon rose high, casting long silhouettes across the carpet. Her own shadow stretched beside her. It hadn't changed, but it felt older now. She retrieved her journal and added a single line. Some truths never demand belief. Only attention. The next morning a letter arrived at her publisher's office. No return address. Inside a single photo, grainy, black and white, taken from a hill above a forest. In the center of the image, a stone circle, faint but unmistakable. On the back, scrawled in blue ink, "It's waking again." Eleanor closed her eyes. The hollow had been quiet. But stories, real stories, don't sleep forever. They wait. She folded the photo, slid it into her coat pocket, and left for the station. Outside, the sky was grey, the wind sharp with memory. She didn't need to know exactly where it was taken. She already knew the way. Eleanor Reed lived many more years, but she never stopped watching the dusk. Her final home was a modest cottage in Vermont, surrounded by whispering pines and a creek that sang in spring. She filled its shelves with books, folklore, history, field notes from students who'd once called her brilliant, mad, or both. But the most important volume was never published. It remained on her writing desk, always open to a blank page. Inside were entries dated sporadically. No chapters, no formal structure, just moments, fragments of people she'd met, shadows she'd known, warnings scribbled in the margins. On her final morning, neighbors found her seated at that desk, her hand resting gently on the open book, her eyes closed, her breath quiet. There was no sign of struggle, no note. Only her final line, written in ink that had not yet dried. "We forget at our peril." Shadows are only silent if ignored, and beside it on the wooden floor her shadow still lay, not stretched, not still, but curled softly beside her, as if sleeping. After her passing, Where Shadows Once Walked found new life. It was republished, translated, studied in universities, debated, feared, loved. Theories bloomed like wildflowers, metaphysical allegory, psychological metaphor, spiritual truth disguised as fiction, but those who had seen the hollow, who had walked roads that no map dared name, they knew. There was more, and in quiet corners of the world, stories began to reappear. Whispers of villages where the sun changed direction, of mirrors that lied, of children whose shadows never returned after a storm, and occasionally someone would find a letter, 7 words always the same. "Come to Dunbray, the truth awaits." If this story moved you, if it made you wonder what lives just beyond the edge of memory, don't forget to subscribe. We bring you more tales like this, carved from history's shadows and wrapped in forgotten wind. And if you're not quite ready to look away, click the video waiting on your screen now. It's a journey into another place where silence speaks louder than words, and memory might just be the only thing keeping the dark at bay. We'll be waiting,